Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to give a few more minutes for folks to log on and then we will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian Batson. I'm the Water Quality Standards Coordinator for Georgia EPD, and I'm here to discuss the human health criteria and our probabilistic risk assessment results. This is the third meeting in a series of meetings that we have been holding during this triennial review period regarding the human health criteria that Georgia plans to adopt. Two previous meetings were on September 21st of 2022 and March 15th of 2023. And the slides for both of these can be accessed on our Water Quality Standards webpage, although a lot of the slides are repeated in this presentation for today. Before we get into the human health criteria, I wanted to update everyone on the 2022 Triennial Review items being considered. We will be wrapping that up by the end of this year. We are adopting EPA's recommended criteria for diazinon and nonylphenol. These two pollutants somehow were not adopted into our rules when EPA recommended them, so we are adopting them now. We are looking at discussing EPA's 2015 human health criteria. We'll be discussing that today and Georgia's derivation process. EPA's 2016 aquatic life criteria for selenium, which we plan to adopt during this triennial review. EPA's 2018 aquatic life criteria for aluminum, which we are not going to be adopting this triennial review and will continue to gather data. EPA had a recommended HABs recreational criteria and or swim advisories, and we are currently working on coordinating with lake managers and other organizations for streamlined communication regarding HABs. We don't have any specific rule language updates at this time, but we'll continue to consider it. We will be adopting site-specific copper and zinc criteria based on a water effect ratio study done for the city of Atlanta. And we are updating designated uses of water bodies that have been nominated for recreation and adopting site-specific chlorophyll A, pH criteria for Lakes Burton, Raybun, and Tugland. So I would like to give you a little bit of background on the human health criteria. A human health criteria is the highest concentration of a pollutant in water that is not expected to pose a significant risk to human health over a lifetime. These criteria are set to protect against harmful concentrations of pollutants through drinking water or consumption of contaminated fish and shellfish. I'll first be reviewing the criteria recommended by EPA and then explain why we chose not to adopt the recommended criteria and what we did instead. The methodology for deriving human health criteria was published by EPA in 2000. And in 2002, EPA published an updated compilation of its national recommended water quality criteria for 158 pollutants. The human health criteria in this compilation were derived using the 2000 methodology. Most of Georgia's current human health criteria were adopted in the early 2000s based on that EPA recommendation. In 2015, EPA updated its national recommended criteria for 94 pollutants to reflect the latest scientific information and EPA policies, including updated fish consumption rate, body weight, drinking water intake, health toxicity values, bioaccumulation factors, and relative source contributions. And I will be going into those in a little more detail. EPA's updated criteria recommendations were also calculated using the 2000 methodology. And just to recap, these 2015 criteria recommendations are for 94 chemicals. And I have right here the equation that is used to calculate the criteria. And if you're like me and too many acronyms make it hard to follow, I have made a kind of simplified version of what this equation looks like. Toxicity endpoints are the result of a study conducted to determine how dangerous a substance is. This equation was used to derive the criteria recommendations in both 2002 and 2015. Input values used to derive the criteria were recalculated, which resulted in updated criteria recommendations. And next I'll talk about the input values and how and why they changed. Toxicity endpoints refers to the hazard quotient for non-carcinogens and the incremental lifetime increased cancer risk for carcinogens. The cancer risks discussed here refer to the increased risk of cancer for each individual pollutant and is in addition to the background cancer risk people are exposed to in everyday life. EPA updated exposure input values based on National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey and NHANES data from the early 2000s. Previous criteria recommendations were calculated based on NHANES data sets from the 1970s to 1990s. So it was time for some updated information. The body weight value is based on the mean body weight for adults ages 21 and older. The drinking water value represents the per capita estimate of community water ingestion at the 90th percentile for adults ages 21 and older. And fish consumption rate represents the 90th percentile of fish and shellfish consumption for adults ages 21 and older. Previous criteria were derived using bioconcentration factors, which only accounts for chemical accumulation in fish due to direct water contact. And now new information has been available, which includes chemical accumulation in fish from all exposure routes, water, diet, sediment, etc. Updated health toxicity values are the minimum quantity of a pollutant that will cause adverse effects. EPA updated these values where appropriate based on available data. And also updated relative source contributions whenever data for this was available. Here is the same equation displaying the values used in EPA's criteria derivation. This is known as the deterministic risk assessment method, which assigns a single value from a range of possible values to each parameter in an equation. Using this method, it is impossible to determine what percentage of the population is protected by the criteria. EPA published criteria recommendations for water plus organism to protect human health from exposure via drinking water and fish consumption, as well as organism-only criteria to protect human health from exposure via consumption of fish only. Georgia currently has one value for each pollutant based on EPA organism-only criteria from 2002. Here we're comparing Georgia's criteria to EPA's 2015 recommendations. For 1122 tetrachloroethane, our current criteria is 4 micrograms per liter. This is the highest concentration of this pollutant in the water column that is assumed to be safe if fish from these waters are consumed over a lifetime. EPA's updated input values yielded criteria values of 0.2 micrograms per liter for water plus organism, meaning this concentration is assumed safe for lifetime consumption of fish and ingestion of water from that water body. For water bodies that are not used as drinking water sources, EPA's recommended criteria is 3 micrograms per liter. EPA's water plus organism criteria is 95% more stringent than their organism-only criteria, and their organism-only criteria is 25% more stringent than our current criteria. EPA's 2015 organism-only criteria, we're comparing it to the 83 pollutants currently in Georgia's current water quality standards. The shades of green represent the percentage of pollutants for which EPA's updated criteria are less stringent, meaning it has a higher criteria value than our current water quality standards. And the shades of red and orange represent the percentage of pollutants for which EPA's updated criteria are more stringent and have a lower criteria value than our current water quality standards. Our current water quality standards are based on organism-only criteria from 2002. So the comparison to EPA's updated water plus organism criteria is understandably much more stringent because it's accounting for an additional exposure route. The goal of the criteria update was not specifically to derive more or less stringent criteria, but to use the best available data to ensure the criteria are adequately protective of the target population. So Georgia had some concerns with the updated criteria recommendation from EPA and its derivation process. One of the concerns is compounded conservatism, which results from using upper bound percentiles for multiple inputs. This can result in criteria values that are unnecessarily overprotective, leading to misallocation of limited resources. A single input value does not adequately reflect the variability among a population, meaning every person doesn't weigh 80 kilograms and drink 2.4 liters of water and eat 22 grams of fish per day. It's also impossible to determine the percentage of the population being protected. And also the EPA criteria were derived using national fish consumption rate data sets. And Georgia wanted to get more Georgia specific and use regional fish consumption rates. And a recap of the differences between the two criteria derivation methods where Georgia has used the probabilistic risk assessment method to derive our criteria. And under this approach, one or more of the exposure variables are inserted into the equation as probability distributions based on variability in the target population. The analysis treats the exposure distributions as random variables and allows for an evaluation of risk to both the entire population and to higher risk subpopulations. So we're able to have more transparent risk management decisions, which I will go over also, and identify the target populations and level of protections. This image represents the distribution of body weight of adults 21 and older from a national data set in EPA's 2011 Exposure Factors Handbook. The deterministic risk assessment method calculates the criteria based on the risk to a person weighing 80 kilograms, meaning 80 kilograms mean body weight. Using the mean body weight to calculate human health criteria does not account for the variability within the population. This distribution graph shows the possible values for body weight that the population has. A probabilistic risk assessment method uses a Monte Carlo simulation to calculate the possible outcomes using the whole range of possible body weights from the distribution. So here's that same equation again, but instead of putting in single point values, we were able to put in distributions for each of these variables. Uses a range of values. Probabilistic risk assessment uses a range of values for one or more parameters. The outcome of probabilistic risk assessment is a distribution of risk rather than a single value. This is known as Monte Carlo analysis. We performed this analysis using software called @risk. The program randomly selected input values from each probability distribution and solved the equation to calculate risk. Since the outcome is a distribution rather than a single value, the criteria values are selected based on risk management decisions selected to protect the target population. For example, the 90th percentile of the population must have an excess lifetime cancer risk equal to or less than 1 × 10⁻⁶, or 1 in 1 million. These are graphs of the distributions that we used in our Monte Carlo analysis. The body weight data is based on National Health and Nutrition Examination, also called NHANES data from 1999 to 2006. The distribution data is from EPA's Exposure Factors Handbook, Chapter 8, which lists body weight values for the 5th, 10th, 15th, 25th, 50th, 75th, 85th, and 95th percentiles. Using an Excel-based tool called @risk, we generated a distribution for body weight based on the available data from the Exposure Factor Handbook. This is the same data set from which EPA selected the 80 kilogram mean body weight input value for the 2015 recommendation. The drinking water consumption rate data is from NHANES data from 2003 to 2006 for adults 21 and older. And it is from EPA's Exposure Factors Handbook, Chapter 3, which lists water ingestion rates for the 25th, 50th, 75th, 90th, 95th, and 99th percentiles. This is the same data set from which EPA selected the 90th percentile value of 2.4 liters per day. For the fish consumption rate, we used EPA's 2014 report, Estimated Fish Consumption Rate for the US population and selected subpopulations. This report used NHANES data from 2003 to 2010 and is the same report from which EPA used the national data set to select the 22 grams per day, 90th percentile national fish consumption rate. This report also provided regional specific distributions, 2 of which were applicable to Georgia. We used a population-based weighted combination of the Inland South and Atlantic Coast data sets, which listed fish consumption rates for the 50th, 75th, 90th, 95th, 97th, and 99th percentiles. Now that we have our data distributions, our at-risk tool runs a Monte Carlo simulation in which the program randomly selects input values from each distribution. This is known as an iteration. For probabilistic risk assessment, multiple iterations are performed to complete the simulation. These three bingo balls represent values selected at random for each input in the equation for a single iteration. The balls are then put back into the mix before the next iteration is performed. For human health criteria derivation, we ran 100,000 iterations, meaning there will be 100,000 different combinations of input values for each simulation. The result will be a distribution of risk from which we will select appropriate values to protect the target population. The probabilistic method allows us to model the range of possible input variables that represent the population as a whole. This covers the range of risk that would be associated with varying fish consumption, varying water consumption, and varying body weight. It also allows us to ensure the appropriate level of protection for select subgroups of the population. For example, subsistence fishers that consume more fish than the majority of the population must be protected at a risk level of 10 to the -4, or 1 in 10,000. Our goal is to evaluate criteria based on the range of risk taken by the public. And this illustration here is just showing that a person that is free climbing is at a much greater risk than a person who is just hiking. And a person that eats a subsistence fisher that consumes fish daily at a higher rate than the average population is at a higher risk than the average population as a whole. Our fish consumption guidelines are based on a risk level of 10 to the -4 and are based on the portion of the population that regularly consumes fish caught in Georgia waters. Our goal in using probabilistic risk assessment is to evaluate the risk to various portions of the population and select the criteria that applies to the appropriate level of protection to both the entire population and to higher risk subpopulations. So we had 3 different scenarios where we calculated the level of risk and the target population. For the 50th percentile of the population, the target risk was 1 in 1 million. For the 90th percentile of the population, the target risk was 1 in 100,000. And for the 99th percentile of the population, the target risk was 1 in 10,000. So we ran a Monte Carlo simulation for each risk scenario described in the previous slide, and each simulation consisted of 100,000 iterations. The most stringent results of the 3 scenarios is then selected as the final criteria. Here's an example of what that looks like. These are not final criteria, just an example, and I'm showing 10 of the 94 chemicals here. The yellow highlighted cells are the least stringent, the most stringent, the lowest values of all the criteria, ensuring that all of these populations will be protected if we are choosing the most stringent of the 3 scenarios. Georgia's current water quality standards have human health criteria for 83 of the pollutants in Georgia's 2015 update. And those 83 criteria are based on the organism only value from EPA's 2002 recommendation. There are 11 pollutants in the update for which Georgia has no current human health criteria. So we'll be adopting those as new pollutants into our rules. Our PRA analysis resulted in 2 criteria values based for each pollutant, which is the same as EPA had 2 values. One to protect human health from exposure through fish consumption, which is the organism only, and one to protect human health from exposure through fish consumption and water ingestion, which is the water plus organism criteria. And we're planning to adopt the organism only criteria values for all water bodies, except for those designated as a drinking water source, which will get the water plus organism criteria values. These criteria updates are for paragraph 5E, Roman numeral 4 in our water quality standards. There are several pollutants in this update which have alternate criteria elsewhere in our rules. Some of them were based on aquatic life protection, but for instances in which multiple criteria values are relevant for a specific pollutant, the more stringent value will apply. This table lists the proposed criteria values that we are adopting, and this table was sent out with the public notice, and there should also be a link in the chat so that if you would like to look at it right now and not try to stare at this tiny screen. I'm not going to be going over each pollutant individually, but wanted to make sure everyone knows where to find each individual criteria that we're adopting. It also shows the existing criteria values that they will replace. And this is also available on our water quality standards webpage. Here we're looking at the percent difference between our updated criteria and our current criteria. And for the organism only criteria, which is on the left, all designated uses, we have a little less than half of the pollutants will be less stringent than our current criteria, and a little more than half will be more stringent. For the drinking water designated use, which will use the water plus organism criteria, a lot more criteria will be more stringent because, again, this is taking into consideration the additional pathway of drinking water, which was not considered in our current criteria. And here are Georgia's proposed human health criteria compared to EPA's criteria recommendations. We looked at these side by side. This is just a sample of what that looks like and the percent difference. And our probabilistic risk assessment results are mostly less stringent than EPA's 2015 criteria recommendations. And we believe this is because of the compounded conservatism that comes from using upper bound percentiles for point estimates. And so we feel that these criteria more accurately reflect the appropriate level of protection. And here's a tentative timeline for our triennial review. These human health criteria will be adopted as part of a rule package that will include some other updates. The comment period for human health criteria will close on February 23rd. We'll have a public meeting for a triennial review wrap-up sometime in the summer of 24, where we'll discuss all of the items being changed during this triennial review. And then The rule package will go to the DNR board for a briefing. We'll hold a final public hearing. And then we're hoping for board adoption in late 2024, early 2025. And it's called the Triennial Review because it is done once every 3 years. This is the 2022 Triennial Review, which we will be wrapping up this year and kicking off the next one in early 2025. And now we can take comments or questions. You can raise your hand in the chat, or raise your hand, or you can type a question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share questions or comments.
This is Andrew Aldridge, and I had a question. So, like at a wastewater plant that discharges to a stream that's considered fishing, do they already test for most of these, or is all this new that they would have to test for in their discharge?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have I guess Liz or Tyler, if you can.
So they would test the priority pollutants one time in their permit application, and then reasonable potential analysis would be done using the annual flow, which is in the rule. That was that under that bullet on that slide that Jillian showed you. So we just have let every NPDES permit holder know about this because some of these criteria are going down, and right now they may not routinely be testing them because they don't have permit limits for it, but they will test for them when they do their permit app. So we'll have one data point at that point.
Thank you, Liz. Do we have any other questions or comments?
There's a couple of questions in the chat. Dominic is asking about bischloromethyl ether, just an FYI, because of commercial labs are currently unable to analyze for this pollutant. Okay, thank you. And which may be one of the reasons why we didn't adopt it initially. So thank you for that feedback, and we will look into that. The next question is for selenium. Is Georgia proposing organism only for the human health criteria? So is selenium part of the human health criteria? I know that we're planning on doing the four pathways. So egg, ovary, fish tissue, water, and intermittent. So we are planning on adopting it that way. Jillian, is it part of the human health criteria? It's not on the list, is it?
I don't believe so.
So I wanted
I can't say
chime
that.
in. It is not human health,
Okay.
or the selenium update is a separate recommendation that's looked at, and it's not considered a toxic, so it wasn't analyzed the same.
And the selenium criteria that we're adopting will be for the protection of aquatic life.
Yes.
And I will cover that in another meeting during the summer where I'll go into more detail about the selenium.
Okay,
criteria.
so there's another question. Will all these pollutants, hold on. I lost it.
Will all these pollutants have to be tested
tested.
in the drinking water, and if so, how often?
That's it. So if it's not, we're not going to set criteria. We would set criteria for the wastewater treatment plants, and it would be based on annual average flows. So please recognize that the criteria is clearly spelled out, that it's based on annual average flow. So that reasonable potential will be done using those flows. The drinking water has MCLs that are required to be tested for. So this is protection of human health uses of those water bodies, either for organism or for organism in water. So hopefully that answers Seth's question.
Would HAB swim advisories potentially be a part of water quality standards? Not during this triennial review, but potentially in the future, we're looking at possible language of if a certain number of swim advisories would trigger a violation of water quality standards. But we're not adopting that at this time. That's just one of the things we're considering while we work on.
And Kevin, the other thing we're doing is NOAA and EPA has the SINA website where they indicate whether there are HAP blooms going on. Our folks are going to be looking at that and trying to verify whether that data is correct or not by collecting data. If it indicates there is a cyanobacteria bloom, we're going to be collecting it and seeing whether that it would result in a swim advisory or not. So we're still in that research end of it, trying to understand these swim advisories, but we are working with the lake managers to come up with a procedure of how you would notify folks if data showed that we needed to issue swim advisories.
Jacqueline Eccles, that's your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Quick question. There seems to be, there is a wide disparity in the data that's presented to you all by EPA and the state's standards as it relates to that data. Is there any particular reason for that, for there to be such? Is it that EPA is high and Georgia's low, or you have any explanation for that?
Sure. So when EPA gives its recommended criteria, states have the option to adopt or come up with their own scientifically defensible criteria. And the method that EPA used for this was just taking one variable for each value and putting that in an equation, which doesn't necessarily, so it's not that our criteria are higher or lower than EPA's. We just hope and believe that they are more accurately reflective of what is protective. So some of them are higher than what EPA is recommending, and some of them are lower than what EPA is recommending. And that is because we've used this Monte Carlo analysis to analyze all different possible combinations of body weight, drinking water, fish consumption. And sometimes that has resulted in a more stringent criteria and sometimes a less stringent criteria. But the goal was not to have criteria that were specifically more stringent or less stringent. It was just about accuracy. Does that answer your question?
I think, let me think about that. Go on to the next person.
Okay.
Let me think about that one.
Sure. Would Burton, Raybon, and Tuglow potentially have a total nitrogen criteria in their standards?
Kevin, that is a potentially yes. When we're looking at our lakes, we're looking at the response variable, the chlorophyll A's, the pHs. We're also looking at the causal variable, which is total nitrogen and total phosphorus. And we're getting pretty strong encouragement from EPA to include those causal variables as specific criteria.
Jacqueline, I also would just like to add that a lot of other states are looking into using probabilistic risk assessment to derive human health criteria. It's not just Georgia. A lot of states are putting off adopting the human health criteria because of the compounded conservatism. And to my knowledge, no one has outright adopted all 94 pollutants. There are some states that are adopted like a subsection of them, and others that are working on just some form of probabilistic risk assessment, some type of Monte Carlo simulation.
Okay. Probably my follow-up question, you wouldn't have the answer to, and it'll get in a long conversation, so maybe I'll hold it for as we get more into this, because,
Okay.
yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
Dominic,
Nutrients.
you're
Oh.
correct. Responding to your message there. So this is just this particular presentation. Jillian kind of touched on all of the things that we're looking at and considering during this triennial review, but this is really kind of focused on the human health criteria piece of it. But yes, we are looking at other criteria and or standard adjustments to our rules. So we've got EPA is continuing to give us lots of things to consider. So we're doing our best to try to keep up with those items.
I'm going to go ahead and share this screen, which shows contact information, how to submit comments, our website. And we can still continue to take questions and comments. I just want to make sure everyone has this information. And we'll be accepting comments on the human health criteria up until February 23rd. So you can submit written, email.
RA has a comment or his hand is raised, and I apologize, Jacqueline, my internet went out. So if you have any questions, would like to call me directly, we can. This is Liz Booth speaking. And we can go over it, or we can have a.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. RA, do you have a question or a comment? And I can't pronounce your name. I'm not even going to try.
Okay, I was having trouble unmuting, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is unrelated to the subject, but I was wondering what the status of the designated use changes. What's the status of that? Of the
So
nominations for designated use changes.
yes, we have had several water bodies nominated for designated use change to recreation, and we're evaluating all the data that has been submitted. This human health criteria has kind of been like a really big focus, and now that we've got these numbers nailed down, we're shifting focus to that. So if you had submitted or were interested in information on the designated use change, that will be coming soon. That's the next area of focus. So I'll be contacting all of the nominators and stakeholders to see what other information is needed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if we have no more questions or comments, we can end here, but I will stay on in case anyone else has any questions or comments they'd like to submit.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and appreciate y'all giving us the time and attention to this matter. Let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you everyone for coming to the meeting. I will be signing off, but you can reach out via email if you have any additional questions or comments. Thank you.
And Jillian, I'd like to thank you for making a complicated issue simplified in a way that people, I hope, understood it. If they have any questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll be glad to go over it with you. And remember that comments can be received until February 23rd. So thank you again, Jillian, for all your hard work.
You're welcome. Thanks.